Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment. But in the past, everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you know, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to, you know, authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it. And that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where, you know, every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on-premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'll give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power. But here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL. And when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. This big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get you get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So, now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PAAS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PAAS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PAAS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about With Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out, but it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Now remember that in both Azure as well as Microsoft 365 services, they both share the same directory service, which is called Azure AD, Azure Active Directory. And your Azure Active Directory and identities, which are your accounts, are the primary security perimeter when it comes to your monitoring, alerting, auditing of what's going on in your system. That basically means that Microsoft ties loads of different security features and capabilities to the different identities that are interacting in the cloud service. So that is going to be your primary security perimeter when it comes to securing your Azure AD environment. So you'll notice that I can go here to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, and I can go to Azure Active Directory, this little blade here, okay? And then from there, I can click on users, and I have the various users that are available here. Now, if you're doing this with me, you may not have all these users. Don't worry about that right now, but you'll see I have various users that I have created. And here's the other thing. If I go to, let's go to another portal. Let's go to portal.microsoft.com, all right, which is the Microsoft 365 side of things, and drop that down and go to active users. Guess what? You'll see the same users. Again, that is because Azure Active Directory is linked to both the Azure cloud services as well as the Microsoft 365 cloud services, when in the end, really, the Microsoft 365 services are just sitting on top of all the Azure infrastructure at the Microsoft data centers. But it's all linked together, okay? And so your user accounts are going to be your primary security perimeter, meaning everything involving security, alerts, reports, auditing, security analysis, threat management. Everything is looking at these users. Everything is monitoring these users and their various activities. So if I click on a user, a particular user, you can see that the information about that user, names, when they last logged on, sign in, the groups they're a member of, who their manager is. Okay, a manager can be given special permissions over something, over a user. What roles, what admin roles or privileges they've been given. You can even look at the devices that they have used. You can look at their licenses. Okay, so if I want to give them a certain license, I could. Okay, now granted, if you're doing this with me, you may not have all the same licenses as me. That's because I've done various courses and added different licenses in the various courses. But if I wanted to give this user here maybe the enterprise mobility plus security license, I could do that, which is going to give them some security capabilities, right? If they're using Exchange Online, their email, you can also see OneDrive information. And the other thing, of course, is maybe I've got a user that has been let go and I need to block that user, so I could say block sign in, and I can block that user from signing in. It might be that this user didn't leave the company. It might be that they're having to be investigated right now, and so we've blocked the user for that reason. So you'll notice it says this user's been blocked from signing in. They'll automatically be signed out of their Microsoft services within 60 minutes. So within an hour, if they're logged on to anything, it's going to log them off. All right, and that's the idea there. All right, but anyway, you again, and if you go back over to let's say portal.azure.com, go back over to the menu button here, go down to Azure Active Directory. Click on users. Okay, you have the same users that are available here, and you have the various services for that. Some of this is the same. You will notice in some cases you'll see a few more features on the Azure Active Directory portal side than Microsoft 365. The Microsoft 365 side, they try to make it a little bit easier for people that may not be IT people working with it, because you can use the Microsoft 365 side. You could actually allow somebody like HR to have access to it, and it'll be a little easier for them. They have a few more things going on here that you can do and manage. So you'll see here revoke sessions, so you can get into blocking and all that. You got a monitoring capability here. You can see any roles they've been given. That involves the privileges and stuff they've been given, what's called administrative units, groups, what applications that this user has been using, devices, authentication methods, all of that stuff. Okay, so ultimately though, here's the sign-in logs. You can see when they log in. But ultimately, the thing to remember here just is that Azure Active Directory, which both Azure as well as Microsoft 365, they link everything to what the users are doing, and they're monitoring what the users are doing. And so all the different capabilities and services that I implement that might involve compliance or security of threat analysis, whatever it may be, is all going to link to some kind of an account. And so that's going to be your primary security perimeter when it comes to dealing with both Azure and Microsoft 365. Now, when it comes to Azure and authentication, one of the concerns that people think about here is the fact that you have Azure AD, which is, of course, the online authentication directory services they have. You have Azure ADDS, which is the Active Directory Domain Services hosted in the cloud. You have third-party authentication services, such as Amazon Web Services. And of course, you have possibly on-premise authentication, which would be on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And of course, one of the concerns you have there is, what if we've got a mixture of these different services? How is this all going to work? Well, of course, Microsoft, one of the big terms that they've pushed for many, many years, I would even say for the last 20 some odd years, is a term called SSO. SSO is single sign-on. And the idea of single sign-on is that a user should be able to have one identity account, one user account that they're using that they can authenticate with one time and get access to all the services that they need access to. And of course, that is definitely what Microsoft has tried to do. For one, if you do have on-premise Active Directory, you can set up Azure AD Connect. So if I go here to the menu button on portal.azure.com and I go to Azure Active Directory, we have Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is a service that can be installed on a server on-premise, and it can synchronize your on-premise user accounts into the cloud. The other thing is, with Azure AD, you can have Azure AD accounts that authenticate with Azure ADDS as well, and with the new Microsoft Entrust services, you can authenticate with services like Amazon and all that. So Microsoft provides us with the ability to allow a user account that can authenticate in all these places at one time, which gives us the single sign-on capabilities. Now, the other thing that Microsoft has started to implement is the ability for multi-factor authentication with passwordless authentication. And well, let's talk about multi-factor authentication first. Multi-factor authentication is the single most powerful capability we can implement in a cloud environment that gives us the ability to basically prevent account breaches. You think about one of the number one reasons accounts get breached in most services is because somebody discovers a person's password. We can implement multi-factor authentication. If I go right here, click the menu button, and go to Azure Active Directory and click on my users, I can go right here, and right here where it says per user MFA, and I can implement multi-factor authentication, all right, for my individual users. All right, so whatever user I've got, like Bob Jones here, I can enable multi-factor authentication for Bob Jones if I want. All right, not only that, if I go over here to service settings, I can control exactly which types of authentication systems that a user can use for multi-factor. Now remember, multi-factor authentication involves not just using a password, but also using it with pairing it with something else. Like, for example, I could have call by phone, where when the person goes to log on, they might put a password in, but then it can call by phone, and the user would have to enter a code. They hit a number that basically the phone call tells them to put. Basically, it'd be like a Cortana type voice talking to you. You can have a text message by phone where it sends a PIN number, a one-time password to your phone. You can have a notification through the mobile app or verification code for the mobile app. If you actually go out there and look at what is called the Microsoft Authenticator. If you've never seen it, if you have a phone or tablet in front of you, you can go to the App Store on that, and you can download the Microsoft Authenticator app, whether you've got Android or iOS. And there's two options for that. You have a one-time password that changes every 30 seconds when you go to log on. And then the other option is you can support a pop-up approval message, all right, where it says, do you approve this authentication? Of course, if you go back over here, you'll see right here, you have notification through the mobile app. That's the pop-up message that says, would you like to approve the sign-on? Or you can also do the verification code where it changes every 30 seconds through the app. And then also you can do hardware tokens. Microsoft supports, you can support what's known as a FIDO2 key. These are becoming more popular. It's basically a USB drive like this, and it has to be inserted into a USB of the computer that you're authenticating with into the domain or into Azure. And you can also, of course, support good old smart cards that have been around forever, which is kind of like what the military uses. They use what's called a common access card here in the United States to authenticate. They have a little smart card reader like this that is utilized. All right, so there are these other systems, of course, that can support that authentication, the smart card and FIDO and all that don't require you to enter a password. And you can also use with on-premise Windows machines, you can support what's called Windows Hello for Business, which can do facial recognition and all of that. So there's a few different solutions that Microsoft has added to help us with the different authentication services that we have in Azure. I want to talk now about the concept of authorization. Now, in cybersecurity techniques, one of the very first things that you would learn as performing a cybersecurity techniques in an environment is this term called AAA. AAA, AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Of course, authentication means the user, of course, has to prove who they are. That involves, again, if they're an Azure AD user just logging on directly from Azure AD, or if like an on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services user, or if they're coming from some kind of third-party service, maybe being authenticated as a guest. Either way, authentication is proving you are who you say you are. Now, the second A is authorization, which is the one I want to focus on right now. Authorization is basically giving access to something. And then the third term, being accounting, would be the monitoring and auditing and all that, meaning you're being watched, you're being audited, you're being logged as a user. But let's talk more about authorization. So when it comes to authorization in Azure AD and Microsoft 365, that is done by a couple things. Number one, in order for users to have access to licenses and products, they have to have you have to issue them a license. And licenses are a subscription-based system, and you'll find that the licenses are all linked to Azure AD. So you'll see the same licenses in Azure as you will in the Microsoft 365 side of things. So here I am on portal.azure.com. If I click the menu button and I go to Azure Active Directory, I can go down here to the licenses blade, and I can look at all products, and you can see all the licenses that I have available. Now again, if you're doing this with me, your licenses may look different than mine. That is not a problem. Don't worry about it. Don't stress, okay? But if I look at this, I have Enterprise Mobility plus Security E5, and I can see that one person has been issued a license. About Office 365, same thing. One person has been assigned a license. If I click on these licenses and click on Service Plan, I can see who's been given a license, which is me. If I click Service Plan Details, I can see what's included with the license. So how do you assign a license? You assign a license. If you come up here to License Users, you can click Assign, and you can assign either a single user a license or a group of users a license if you want. And that's how you're going to do that. So that is the first way you're going to authorize somebody. You're going to authorize them to have access to certain services. There'll be things that they'll get access to. For example, if we come back over and we look at the Office 365 E5 license and look at Service Plan Details, here's all these different things they're going to get, like Microsoft Teams, for example. As soon as they get that license, they will have access to Microsoft Teams. All right, and again, if you jump over to portal.microsoft.com, you're going to see these same licenses. So if I click Show All right here, drop down where it says Billing, you have licenses. You can see the same exact licenses through Microsoft 365. Okay. Now the other way that, of course, users are authorized is with roles, and I'm not going to get deep into roles right now. But if I go back over to portal.azure.com, click the menu button and go down to Azure Active Directory, I can click on Roles and Administrators, and these different roles are what's going to give different privileges. So if you want to make somebody an admin, for example, if I want to give somebody the right to create user accounts, I have a role called User Administrator, and I can assign that role to that user. You will have the same exact roles over in Microsoft 365 side as well. Okay, same exact roles. All you got to do is go to portal.microsoft.com, drop down roles, role assignment, you'll see the same exact roles. All right. And then the third way we authorize users is through the different Azure resources that we're working with. So, for example, when you start getting into things like virtual machines and storage accounts and all these various things, when you do that, you will see, let me go to this thing called a resource group. So a resource group is like a container in Azure. I'll just create one called Test real quick. And when you go to a resource group is what's going to contain objects, right, in Azure, like virtual machines and things like that. There's a blade called IAM, and the IAM blade is, you can go here where it says add, and you can add this thing called a role assignment. and you can give individual privileges to that particular resource. So if I was doing this on like a virtual machine or a storage account, I could say, well, you are an owner, that gives you full control, or you're a contributor, which gives you contributor ability, allows you to add stuff but not delete stuff, and things like that. And not give other roles, I should say, not assign people roles. So it's a step down from admin rights. You give people reader role, which gives you the ability to read data. Again, I'm not really thoroughly getting into roles right now in this video. I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of authorization. So those are the main ways that we authorize things in both Azure and Microsoft 365. We have licensing, which gives out the ability to access certain services and applications and features. You have roles, which gives admin rights, or you can give role privileges, role privileges over just individual objects. Okay, so those are the main ways you're going to deal with authorization. That word authorization essentially means that you are giving access or access control over services in your cloud environment. Let's talk now about concepts of integrating your Azure Active Directory environment with another identity provider, such as Google or Facebook, or maybe some third-party company that you're building a trust relationship with, and you need authentication to work. So here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button here. We're going to go down to Azure Active Directory, and then we're going to go to External Identities. All right, and then from there is a blade called All Identity Providers. Okay, so as you can see very easily here, Microsoft has already got a button here for Google. If you were going to establish a relationship with a Google account, you'd have to start this on the Google side as well. But then from there, you can plug the information in that Google provides you with. And the same thing for Facebook. And then over here, you have new SAML WS-Fed IDP. So what that is, so this is Security Assertion Markup Language, that is SAML. And then WS-Fed is the Web Service Federation Identity Provider. The idea there, that is a sort of a vendor-neutral solution that involves using federation. You can pretty much, it's the industry standard. So every vendor out there under the sun supports SAML. So if you're not dealing with Google, you're not dealing with Facebook, you're dealing with some other organization, they can support SAML, and if they've got a federated server, federated services set up, and all you got to do is go there and you can plug in information regarding that. You'd have to work with that other organization or that other company. You could plug in the information here that matches that organization. Now below that, you've also got the providers that are already configured here, which is Azure Active Directory, your Microsoft accounts, and email one-time passcode. So Azure Active Directory obviously is the native identity provider that we have in the Microsoft environment. Okay. If you've set up a hybrid environment, you'd see some indication there as well. And then below here you have Microsoft account. That is just a personal account. So if you're supporting personal Microsoft accounts, you have that mentioned there. And then email one-time password is listed here. That is, of course, if you are supporting the one-time passcodes to be used for multi-factor authentication. Okay. And then if you did, this down here, if you did configure your SAML WS Federation, Security Assertion Markup Language Federation provider, that would show up down here, and you can always remove that if you ever needed to. Okay, so this is the idea of configuring the identity providers. If you ever needed to, you could set that up, whether it be Google, Facebook. Main thing to remember, there isn't really much here you need to memorize. Just know that it's done through this external identities area here, and that Google and Facebook are your two native ones, and then for everybody else you would use this option right here. Now hopefully you watched my foundation videos at the beginning of this course, and you probably should already have an understanding of what Active Directory is. So if you didn't watch it, you definitely should, but I am going to overview a few things here with you just to make sure we're 100% sure on what Active Directory is if you're not familiar with it. So Active Directory is the technology that Microsoft created back in the year 2000. Well, actually, they started working on it in the late 90s. It was originally called NT5, and Active Directory was called, the server that it was going to be installed on was called NT5, and then the directory service technology was called NTDS, which stood for New Technology Directory Services. Microsoft, I guess, felt like the marketing team at Microsoft, I guess, felt like that wasn't a cool enough name, so they renamed NTDS to Active Directory. ADDS, which is Active Directory Domain Services, which I kind of agree, it is a cooler name. But the idea of Active Directory on premise, it's built off of a protocol called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which was pretty cutting edge back in the year 2000. Not so much nowadays, but it was back then. Lightweight Directory Access Protocol is based on a protocol, a series of services called the X500 of standards, and these service standards go back to like the telephone days actually, and so they took this naming system from this X500 standards, and they built LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which is a way of organizing lots and lots of objects. And that's what a directory service does, right? It helps you organize things like user accounts and groups and your devices or computer accounts and all that. So in Active Directory, we have domain controllers, which are domain controllers contain a database, which is the Active Directory database, and this is where all your user accounts and groups and all that would be on premise. Active Directory also uses the symbol of a triangle, or I should say Microsoft uses the symbol of a triangle when they represent what is called a domain, which is the security boundary that we have in Active Directory that kind of controls everything that's going on in your environment. So in an on-premise environment, you would generally set up a domain controller. At that point, you got your triangle. You would want multiple domain controllers so that if one failed or went down, you'd have another one going. Also, another reason for multiple domain controllers is so that you can kind of balance the load of computers trying to communicate, right? And so these domain controllers replicate. So again, you have this little user account here. It's going to replicate over this other machine. So it doesn't matter which machine this user logs onto. Maybe these thousands of computers that we have here. It doesn't matter if the machine authenticates to that domain controller or that other domain controller. Now, generally speaking, when a computer is logging on to a domain controller, it's going to use a protocol called Kerberos. That's the security protocol that it uses, and it'll query DNS to locate where a domain controller is, right? And the domain controller will generally send you to the closest domain or DNS server will generally send you to the closest domain controller of where you are. So if you were in, and like this, if this domain controller was in New York City, and this domain controller was in Dallas, Texas, okay, well, if your client is closer to New York City, DNS is going to send you to that one. If your client is closer to Dallas, Texas, it's going to send you to that one. Okay, and so that's kind of how that was, set up. All right. Now, fast forward 20 years later, and you start, or not even 20 years later, more like 15 years later, LDAP is very dated. It doesn't support all the latest and greatest web standards. So Microsoft decided to create Azure Active Directory, which is built off the latest and greatest security standards out on the internet, and it works with third party as well. It works with non-Microsoft stuff like Amazon and Google and all that. And so Active Directory can link to your cloud services with the help of this thing called Azure AD Connect, which can synchronize your accounts out to Azure AD, which can then allow somebody to log on one time, and they'll log on to their domain, the triangle here, and then they'll also log on to Azure AD. And this allows you to achieve what we call seamless SSO. Seamless SSO means you just log on one time and you get access to both locations. Seamless single sign-on basically means you're logging on in both places. Now ultimately, though, Active Directory, it's still available. It'll be available for, I'm sure, a while into the future, but it is a dated technology. Nowadays, everything is starting to be hosted out in the cloud. Now, I also want to say, not going to get in deep into this, but you can host ADDS in the cloud as something called Azure ADDS. So you can set this service up in Azure called Azure ADDS. Let me adjust my font here, but it's called Azure ADDS, Azure Active Directory Domain Services, okay? Azure ADDS. You can host that in the cloud, and if you wanted to, you could begin migrating services over, and you can get a high-speed link to Azure on-premise, like ExpressRoute. There's a thing called ExpressRoute. Get a high-speed link put into your facility directly into Azure, and you would be hosting Active Directory in the cloud. So if your company still wants to use Active Directory, but they don't want all the issues with having to deal with the on-premise servers, you could actually use Azure ADDS to do that. So that hopefully gives you another good overview of what Active Directory is. Again, it is a bit dated, but nowadays there's still many companies out there using it, and Microsoft is not planning to get rid of it anytime soon. So don't worry, I'm not saying they're getting rid of it right now, but they are trying to encourage people to move to the newer technologies, such as Azure AD, or even maybe get rid of your on-premise servers and start and host Azure. If you absolutely got to have ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, with LDAP and Kerberos, you could use the version of it that's being hosted online. All right, I'd like to now kind of overview a few things involving Azure AD. Now, Azure AD, of course, is the online directory services, or also what we call the identity provider that we use for both our Azure services as well as our Microsoft 365 services. So they both share the same identity provider. They both share the same directory services. The directory services or identity provider is where your user accounts and groups and devices and permissions and all that is going to be managed. So the starting point usually for this would be portal.azure.com. If we click the menu button here, we'll go to Azure Active Directory, and you can see all the various blades over here that are available. All right. So mainly, there's four main ingredients that I want to focus on here. The first being the user's blade. Of course, this is where our user accounts live. Now, again, don't worry if you're doing this with me. You don't have all the same users as me. Don't worry about that. But this is where our users are, right? And we can create users and all that stuff up here, which I'm not going to do in this video. We can manage our users by clicking on a user, and we can reconfigure the different settings that are available for us through these blades here. So that's just individual users we're talking about. All right. Now, if we click back on our little breadcrumb here, hyperlink, or you can always go to the menu button and go back to Azure AD, that'll bring you back to the main blades. The second thing to look at is groups. Groups indicate different groups of users, and again, don't worry if you don't see all the same groups as I have in my environment, okay? But this is where groups are. So groups, you can group users together, and then those groups can be used for things like building a team, like in Microsoft Teams. They can be used for things like SharePoint, and whenever you need to give a group of people some kind of resource, privilege, license, access to something, groups are going to help you do that. It's going to save you a lot of time. You have, like a sales group, and maybe you got a sales department that's like got 1,000 people in it. You can create a sales group and put all the salespeople in the group, and instead of having to manage each user individually, you can manage it using the group. That's the idea behind groups. Now let's go back. The third thing is devices. That represents the devices that users would log on to, okay? So I go over here to devices, and again, don't worry if you don't have any devices in your environment right now. I have one called NYC Client 1 linked, but ultimately, the idea of devices, you can see what devices, whether they be a Windows-based operating system or even a non-Windows-based operating system, or even a device like a smartphone, like an iPhone or an Android phone or an iPad or an Android tablet or something like that, they'll show up here as well. I'm not getting into how you link those in this video, but you can link all of that in here. And what's great about that is you can then deploy policies and things like that out to those devices and manage those devices just like you would back in the days with on-premise Active Directory. ADDS you had what was called GPOs, group policy objects, that would do that. You have the same sort of concept here in the Azure environment. And the fourth thing that I want to mention involving Azure AD, the fourth main ingredient, is roles administrators, which of course gets into granting access to things. So giving out rights. We used to use groups to do that with our on-premise environment. Now we use what are called roles, and the reason roles are so great is because unlike using group-based permissions that we had on-premise, a role will always tell you everything it has access to, whereas groups never did that. It was a big nightmare to deal with groups like that. So, for example, I can go down here and look at this user administrator role, and I can click on description, and I can read the description of what that role can do. And then I can also see every privilege that it has as well. All the various privileges, all the various rights that it's been given is all listed here. And so that is the idea of roles. All right. Again, not getting into assigning roles or any of that in this video, just overviewing these things, just to get an idea of Azure AD. So again, Azure AD is the identity provider, the directory service that we use in our Azure services and our Microsoft 365 services for giving access to our users. It's where you're going to create users, manage users, deal with groups, deal with your roles, deal with devices. All of that is going to be managed inside of Azure Active Directory. I want to now take a look at how we can create users inside our Azure environment. So, of course, in Azure we have a directory services known as Azure AD. Okay, a lot of people think that Azure AD is just like on-premise Active Directory, but maybe handled through virtual machines in the cloud, but that's actually not the case. Azure AD is a newer system than the on-premise Active Directory that was created back in the year 2000, or I should say before that, because it was in beta for a while. But with Azure AD, it is a fully functional cloud-based directory services that can hold our different users, groups, and handle authentication with passwords and other multi-factor authentication-based systems and all that. So we're going to look at how we can create user accounts in Azure Active Directory. So to begin with, here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to look right here in the upper left-hand corner, and there's this little symbol right here, the 3 lines. A lot of people call that the menu button. Some people call it the hamburger. I guess it's supposed to look like, 2 pieces of bread and a piece of meat. I always just argue that IT people just love to talk about food, so maybe that's it. I don't know. But another option for getting to Azure AD, you can go over here to right here where it says Azure Active Directory. But I tend to like to be in the habit of using the menu button because you're not always going to be on this screen. So I'm going to go to the menu button here, and you will look down here and see these here are called blades. All right. Another interesting name that they give things here, but this is called a blade. So we're going to click on the Azure Active Directory blade, okay? At that point, we are now in Azure Active Directory, and we can go over here to the users blade, and this is where we can begin creating user accounts, all right? So from there, now you might notice that I have a bunch of user accounts in my little environment here just because I've some of my other courses I've created some users, but you can ignore those. You will not have all those users right now, so don't worry about all that. But if I want to create a user account, I'm going to go right here. I'm going to click to create a user, right? So new user, and then I'm going to say create a new user, all right? From there, all I got to do is choose to create a user. I'll explain what invite user is in just a moment, but if I want to create a user, I just go here and specify what I want that user's name to be, okay? Now, one thing of note, you will notice that my the @ symbol, this is called the user principal name, which is a username and then an @ like an email address type name. You'll see mine says examlabpractice.com because I have registered a custom domain name, which I'm not getting into right now on how to do that. Just know that it is possible to do that. You can register a custom domain name if you want, okay, but we're not getting into the details on that just yet. So I'm just going to create a user named Bob Jones. You can pretty much come up with any name you want here, and just put that in there, and then Bob Jones, first name Bob, last name Jones. At that point, you can do auto-generated password, And if you click show password, you can see what that password is, or you can say, let me create the password, which you can create your own password for the user. And then essentially what would happen is you would tell the user what that password is, and then as soon as they log in, Azure Active Directory is going to force them to change the password. You could also assign them to groups. Not getting into groups right now. You can also assign them to roles, which I'm not talking about roles right now either. Although, in a nutshell, groups can give different access to different resources using groups, and with roles you can actually give administrative permissions and things like that. But again, not getting into groups and roles at the moment. From there, you could say block sign in for the user if you want. This means the user will not be able to log on right now. Maybe you just want to create the account, and then maybe you're going to allow them to log on later down the road. Or maybe you temporarily just want to turn a user off. You can actually go into the user's properties and turn this, set this to block later if you want. Then you got usage location. Now, I would like to say, even though I'm not really talking a whole lot about licensing right now, one of the things you do in Azure AD in some cases is you give them licenses to things, especially if you start using Microsoft 365 and you're working with, you know, the Office services, and maybe you're given access to Teams and Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and different products. You'll need to assign them licenses, and it is very important that you associate a usage location. If you don't, you cannot assign any licenses, okay? And the other thing is, and I haven't really gotten into this just yet, but there is licenses involving Azure Active Directory. Right now, when you start out with a free account with Azure Active Directory, you have a free Azure Active Directory license, and then you can upgrade to things like Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Premium 2 license, which gives you even more capabilities out of Azure Active Directory, which again, I'm not thoroughly explaining licenses right now. I just wanted to throw that out there. The main point I want to get across to you right now is that even though Azure Active Directory will allow you to bypass this and not associate a usage location, it is important that a user does have a usage location. And if you start trying to give the user a license and they can't get a license, it could be because you did not assign them a usage location. So I'm going to go ahead and just put in United States here. All right, and then we could say job title. Maybe Bob Jones is going to be a, let's say that Bob Jones is a help desk level 1. All right, support. All right, help desk level 1 support. That's his title. His department will be IT. All right, company is exam lab practice. All right, and then of course you can also associate a manager to the user if you wanted to, and that way you have the ability to look up who their manager is, and their manager can be given special privileges, which I'm not getting into just yet. All right, so from there, if I want, I can go ahead and click to create, and it says this user has been successfully created. All right, so the next thing I want to show you here is what the invite user is. If I click new user again and I click to create a user or invite user, it really doesn't matter. Either one's going to give you the same options, but you'll notice that if you said invite, it's going to default to invite user. So that is known as an external. You're inviting an external user, also known as a guest. Okay, so in a lot of cases, your company might be working with people that don't necessarily work as an employee for the company. It could be like a contractor, some kind of consultant or something like that. I know for me, I've done consulting work. I've actually done consulting work directly with Microsoft before, and they invited me as a guest to their Azure AD service, and we had meetings and things like that through Teams about the project we were working on and all that. And that's a common practice for a business to, if they want to temporarily give access to a user, this is a great way to do it, especially if the user is not a full-time employee, they're just a consultant or something like that. They're just temporarily working on some kind of a project. This is a great way to handle that. So from there, you would put in, let's say you've got a user. Let's say the user is, we'll do Greg Johnston. All right. And Greg Johnston's email address is gregjohnston@gmail.com. All right, maybe he's just using his personal email address. So at that point, you would put in that information, and you could send him a personal message like, hey Greg, oops, does help if you actually can type. Hey Greg, please accept this link. Okay, so what'll happen is you can click to invite. It's going to send a link to this user, gregjohnston@gmail.com. They can accept the link. It'll from there it'll let them create a password. They can sign in, and they can be given access to resources. Which again, I haven't really gotten into how we can give access to resources right now. Okay. I'm just simply showing you how you can invite a guest. A guest can be invited. You might say, well, is that guest going to be more restricted or less restrictive? You can actually give a guest user account pretty much the same privileges as a regular user account. The thing is, though, is that with the help of these things called access reviews, guests can be a little bit heavier scrutinized than a regular user sometimes would. And you can periodically have these reviews done on whether or not this person should remain a guest. But I'm not getting any of that right now. I just wanted to point out that you could. Okay, you're welcome to try this out yourself. You could invite yourself as a guest. If you have a personal email address, you could try inviting yourself as a guest to your own environment and try logging on. That's a good little thing you could give a shot at right now if you wanted to. But then from there, we could continue filling all this out. Groups, roles, block sign-in, usage location, job title, department, company, manager. You're going to see it's pretty much the same thing as creating a user. The only difference is this guest user will get to keep their own personal email address or whatever email address that's put right here. All right. Okay. So the next thing I want to show you, let's go back over here. Go back to the user's blade, and so I wanted to show you that we do have the ability to download all of our users to a spreadsheet if we want. We can click download users, and it will basically download it to a CSV file. Okay, if you want to pull that up, you can see all your user information in a spreadsheet. Remember, you're not going to have all these users that I've got. I created these users previously, okay, just in a previous course, but don't worry that you don't have all these user accounts, because you're still going to be able to practice everything that you want here. And then, but the next thing I want to show you is if you go over here to bulk operations, you have a bulk create option, which is kind of interesting. A bulk invite and a bulk delete. So if we go to bulk create, it's going to let us download a spreadsheet. All right, and we can open that spreadsheet up. Let's open that spreadsheet up with Excel. All right, and then what you can do is you can create users based on this CSV file, this comma separated value file. Okay, so they show an example of doing that, like, you know, create Chris Green is the user they use as an example, and then we'll say Chris Green at, and then whatever your domain name is. You might have a name that says .onmicrosoft.com. You'd need to put that in there. In my case, I've registered a custom domain name, examlabpractice.com, so I could put that in, and then I could specify what I want the password to be. Okay, I'll just say, let's just do this little, one of Microsoft's favorite little passwords right there, which I'm not going to leave it that, but that's what it will be right now. And then if I want to block sign in? No, I'm not going to block sign in. And then I could do, you know, first name is Chris, last name is Green, job title is sales manager or something, you know, department is sales, so on and so forth. Then you could go ahead and fill the rest of this out. Now imagine if you had a situation where you had your company recently absorbed another company. Maybe this other company is a smaller company that's got 50 employees or something. And if you had a spreadsheet maybe that was provided by that company's HR department or something, you could build the spreadsheet out like that, like you see on my screen, and then you could actually import all this and have all those users created without having to manually type all that in. So that could really save you a lot of time. Okay, so I've got a Chris Green. Let's also create another one. Let's do Larry Thomas. So Larry Thomas at examlabpractice.com. We'll just do the same password. And again, as soon as the user logs on, it makes them change their password. Larry Thomas. Maybe Larry Thomas is a marketing manager. Okay. He's part of the marketing department, which I just realized that I messed that little that up right there, so I'm just going to fix that. All right. And of course, again, you could fill the rest of this out, but I'm not going to do that. All right. So from there, I can go and save this. So we'll just say, save this. I'm just going to save it to my desktop real quick. All right, once it's saved, now I'm going to jump back over into here, and we're going to upload that spreadsheet. Okay. All right, so I selected where it was on my computer, and I'm going to hit submit. And if you've got any errors, it's going to let you know. Okay, hopefully we don't have any errors, and it should be able to create those users successfully. So imagine you had a spreadsheet of 50 people, 100 people, 500 people. This could really cut down on the amount of time. I also use the analogy of, it's like, imagine a school university, and they've got enrollments with a lot of students starting, and maybe they got an enrollments department that collects all the student data through a spreadsheet. You would be able to use that to your benefit. You wouldn't have to go through and do all the clicks. So let's go ahead and try refreshing, and let's see if our users are there. So there is Chris Green, and there's Larry Thomas. So it was able to create the users. Of course, another way we can create users that I'm not getting into right now is you can use PowerShell. There's also Azure CLI, which it's based on Linux. If you're familiar with Linux, the Azure CLI commands will be used, but I'm not showing you how to do that just yet. I just wanted to show you how you could do all this graphically. So as you can see, very easy to jump right in and create user accounts. Also invite users as guests using the Azure portal. I'd like to now talk about planning for Microsoft 365 with your on-premise infrastructure. So as you can probably imagine, as we move towards the cloud in a lot of our environments, we've all got, especially in the medium to larger businesses, a lot of us have ADDS domains, Active Directory Domain Services, on-prem. And of course, what we want to do is eventually be able to tie all of this together. If we are going to have both, if we're going to have the on-premise side of things as well as the cloud side of things, we want to be able to link those things together and make life easier for ourselves as well as our users in terms of logging on and getting access to the resources in both places, both on-premise as well as in the cloud. So I want to talk about that with you, about some of this planning that's going to be involved, because this is sort of moving towards being able to actually perform the action of doing synchronization in our environment. So looking here, we're talking about Microsoft 365 and the whole integration with our on-prem environment. So first off, your Microsoft 365 environment has all these wonderful online services. You know, you get into Exchange Online, and you get into SharePoint Online, and you have Teams, which, you know, they used to have Skype for Business and all that. Well, now you still have some of that stuff like Exchange and SharePoint and all that stuff on premise, and Microsoft wants to make it clear that you can actually integrate all this stuff together. You can have your on-premise equipment working in conjunction with your cloud services, and they can play friendly with each other, in other words. So when you decide to integrate and work with a hybrid environment where we're going to link everything together on-premise and in the cloud, we can integrate all that stuff. We can synchronize our users and stuff out to the cloud, synchronize users, and have our identities all out there, our passwords out there. We have different ways of doing that we'll be talking about, such as password hash synchronization, and then this can also provide us with single sign-on, which is going to allow us to, put our credentials in on-prem, and then the credentials will also work out in the cloud as well. This is going to make life a whole lot easier for people, okay? And then, of course, integrating our on-premise servers is a part of this as well, and having things communicate with each other. For example, if I want to host my Exchange server on-premise still for a while, or maybe for a long period of time, I can have Exchange on-premise as well as Exchange in the cloud, and I can have the two working together. I can have SharePoint server on-premise and SharePoint online on the cloud and have things working together there as well. So Microsoft provides us with ways to do this, but we do need to think about it. We need to plan it out. We need to decide what exactly are we trying to accomplish. What is our goal? and then sort of go tactfully, strategically, if you will, towards accomplishing that goal. Okay, so integrating Microsoft 365 with our directory service. So Microsoft has Azure AD Connect, which is going to be the service that's going to do this. And if you think about it like this, if you have on-premise users, in most cases, you don't want to have an on-premise user in ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, and then also have to create the same user manually out in the cloud to try to make all this work. Not to mention, even if you were to somehow magically set everybody's passwords to be the same, that would be a bit of a pain in the butt because we'd have a password policy where a user would change their password or be forced to change their password, but it would be different in the cloud. So it's great to have a way to synchronize all this and sort of mirror your on-premise accounts with your Microsoft 365 and Azure AD accounts. All right. So we have directory synchronization with the help of Azure AD Connect, and this is all possible with that. This is going to make it where your on-premise user accounts will be recreated out in the cloud, and those are kind of linked together with the help of your Azure AD Connect service. And when somebody changes their password on-premise, for example, it's going to be reflected in the cloud. So it's going to make life a whole lot easier for you. So this is one of the reasons why you would want to go to a directory synchronization and Azure AD Connect hybrid-based scenario. Okay, and again here, one of the things that we can achieve that's great is single sign-on. Single sign-on is also known as SSO, right? SSO means that, our account, our identity, we as a human being or whatever, we have an account name we can put in. For example, I might be jc@examlabpractice.com, and I could have a JC user account on premise, a JC in the cloud. If I'm using Azure AD Connect, then it's all the same. jc@examlabpractice.com on-prem, jc@examlabpractice in the cloud. It's all reflected. I can log on, same username, same password, and everything's wonderful. All right. So, and when I say everything's wonderful, I mean, as a user, if I change my password, I'm not having to change it in two different places. I'm changing it one time, and it's being reflected in the cloud as well. So it makes life a whole lot easier on the user, and of course, again, it makes life easier on us, right? So directory sync with or without password hash synchronization or pass-through authentication. Those are, by the way, two of the most common ways that people use Azure AD Connect. They use hash synchronization or what we call PTA, pass-through authentication. And by the way, I'll also tell you that hash synchronization is by far the most common, and it's also sort of the easier one to work with, but pass-through authentication has some benefits as well. So when you choose which of the methods you're going to be using for Azure AD Connect, your user essentially can log on with their on-premise environment. Once we've set up our hybrid environment, our users can log on to our on-premise environment using their domain name / their username. And if you go to your Microsoft 365, Azure AD, all that stuff, and people log on from the cloud, they can use their username @domain.com, essentially their email address type name. And by the way, on-premise Active Directory can authenticate you that way as well. That's called a user principal name, right? UPN. So the username is going to work the same in both environments. Okay. Now, as far as like password hash synchronization, pass-through authentication, with password hash synchronization, your actual user password hashes, which are the encrypted versions of your passwords, are actually synchronized out to the cloud, and there's a copy of those out there on the Microsoft Cloud Service, and therefore a user can log on premise and be authenticated to the cloud. Or if you have a user who's working from home or they're away and they still need to get access to their cloud resources, the password's going to be the same in the cloud, so they can log back on, they can get access to all their cloud resources. With password authentication, you actually have to have a service that's going to do the process of authenticating people from the cloud. The cloud actually doesn't get a copy of your passwords, essentially. What happens is the cloud talks to an agent that's located on premise, known as the pass-through authentication agent, PTA agent, and at that point the password is encrypted. When somebody tries to log on, it gets sent back to the on-premise network from the cloud. The on-premise network authenticates you, and the person gets to log on. Of course, there's a downside to that, which is, of course, if the cloud loses access with our on-premise domain, then people on the outside who are trying to authenticate to the cloud using an on-premise user account would not be able to log on. So, of course, there is that. Okay. So those are some of your considerations as far as like just thinking through things and planning. Trying to sort of plan things out and understanding the reasons why we would want to move forward with this hybrid-based Azure AD Connect synchronization solution in the first place. In the Microsoft 365 and Azure AD cloud services, Microsoft has multiple methods for authentication. Of course, the standard username and password method that's been around for decades is available, but as you can imagine, there are security threats by just using that. Mostly the fact that users' passwords get phished a lot of times. People fall for phishing attacks. So Microsoft has included some alternative ways that users can authenticate to their cloud service. So I want to talk about that now. And we're going to get into what these different methods are, including FIDO2 and this whole passwordless based system. Now, what exactly is passwordless based authentication? Well, as you can probably guess, this is going to include methods that does not require a person to put in a username and password in order to authenticate. Or mostly this is going to prevent somebody from having to put their password in, or at least just a password or just a PIN number. We want to have another method. So this can actually work in conjunction with multi-factor authentication as well, MFA. So depending upon what the needs are of your organization, there's going to be better solutions that may fit what you're trying to accomplish. All right. Not only that, depending upon if you're a company or you're part of the government or whatever it may be, you would want to select an option that's going to best meet the needs of that environment. Now, there's mostly, when it comes to this system, there's three main options that you can go with. You have Windows Hello for Business, you have Microsoft Authenticator app, and then you got what's called FIDO2 security keys. So let's take a look and discuss these different options. Now, the first thing to think about is this nice little table here sort of shows what's inconvenient versus convenient, what's considered high security versus low security. And as you can see, passwords are very convenient, but they're very low security, right? Because password is just something as opposed to something you have to have or something you are, such as using a biometric. A password can be guessed sometimes, but more commonly nowadays people are falling for phishing attacks where they get tricked into telling their password. Or another thing that happens is they use the same password on lots and lots of different websites, and then one of the websites gets hacked and the password database shows up on the dark web, and then hackers now have your password for not only that website but other websites, including Azure AD and Microsoft 365. So we can go all other ways. One being passwords plus two-factor authentication. So what that would mean is, like with the multi-factor authentication system, Microsoft requires you to have some other method, like your cell phone, and maybe you get a text message with that cell phone, and you put that code in. Of course, that's a bit inconvenient. Requires somebody to have to open up their phone and put in the code, or use the app or whatever it may be. But it is very high security to do that, and it's going to be one of the best ways to prevent the whole phishing problem. Another option is to use passwordless based authentication, and passwordless based authentication doesn't necessarily require you to unlock your cell phone or whatever it is in order to authenticate. There are of course methods that will involve your cell phone, but it's not a requirement. All right, so let's take a deeper look at the different options. We'll start with Windows Hello for Business. So Windows Hello for Business is a great feature that's built into Windows 10 and higher operating systems. And the idea of Windows Hello for Business is to simply allow biometric. such as a facial recognition or fingerprint scanning. You can also pair this with a PIN number if you want. So the great thing about it is somebody literally can just sit in front of their computer and unlock their machine, and when they unlock their machine, they authenticate, and they can also be authenticated with Azure AD if they've got their device linked into Azure AD. Okay, so if Azure AD is identity provider, you could also have an on-premise environment. It can work with that as well. But as you can see in the little diagram, when a user joins Azure AD, it creates a trust relationship between their computer and Azure AD, and so that Azure AD can use Windows Hello for Business as an authentication token to authenticate with Azure AD. From there, Azure AD generates a security token, or what's known as a trust token, when you're part of that cloud service, and so you authenticate and are given a security token that then allows you to access all of the stuff in the Azure AD and Microsoft 365 environment. Okay, this is securely passed back and forth using PKI, which means it uses a public-private key-based system, which is pretty much the system that we use on securing pretty much every website under the sun these days. This also achieves what's known as SSO, single sign-on, meaning a user is not having to keep up with a bunch of credentials. They put their credential in one time, and they're going to seamlessly authenticate in the different locations. So you've also got the Microsoft Authenticator app. Now again, the Microsoft Authenticator app is going to require you to download the app onto a smartphone or tablet. And the one thing that's different about the app is there's a couple of different options you can use. One would be to have a code that flashes up on the screen, but more commonly now you have an option where it's just hit a button on your phone. So the Authenticator app pops a message up on your phone within the app, and you just click approve on your phone. Again, this is an app you download from the app store on your phone. So if you've got whatever kind of phone or tablet you've got right now, if you go into a quick search for the Microsoft Authenticator app, you'll see that. And it's very, very easy to register it with Azure AD as well. Okay. Notice, of course, too, it'll give you a number of seconds to approve a authentication request before it times out. Okay. All right, and then finally, we've also got FIDO2 security keys. FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. Okay, and this is basically an alliance that was built a few years back, where different companies can be part of this alliance, and they can generate these different keys. These little usually USB keys, although you can use Bluetooth or NFC near field communication to do this, and this is something you carry around with you, and you just plug it into your computer through the port, or hook it in through Bluetooth or NFC, and at that point it can authenticate you with the machine and give you access to the network. So you would be authenticating to the computer as well as Azure AD at the same time. Of course, you would have to purchase these devices in order to utilize the devices, and so company's going to have to spend some money on that. But you can buy these in bulk, and they're not super expensive. And again, this makes it a lot harder on a hacker, because they'd have to have be able to steal that key in order to break into your account. So that is the different passwordless based authentication systems we've got available, and this is really going to help improve the security that you've got on your cloud service. All right, so multi-factor authentication, we got to have our licenses. That's important. That's definitely part of the administration of it. Let's start here on portal.azure.com. We'll go to our Azure AD blade, and then go back over here to users, and again, here is multi-factor authentication. This is where we're going to do it. Don't forget, if the resolution of your monitor is kind of low, you may have to click the ellipse symbol. So we'll go back over here to multi-factor authentication, and just kind of run down through here. So if I wanted to enable multi-factor authentication, there is bulk abilities to enable it for everybody, but maybe I just want to enable it for, I don't know, Bob Jones. I can go right over here to the right, and I can click to enable this for Bob Jones. So then at that point it says about enabling multi-factor auth. If your users do not regularly sign in through a browser, you can send them this link, and then they can go ahead and register. Because what will happen is the next time this user goes to authenticate, it is going to make them register for multi-factor authentication. So what exactly does that mean when they do that? Well, let's jump back over real quick and look at our users again, okay? So if we click on Bob Jones, for example, we can go right here to Authentication Methods. And right now, this information has not been registered for Bob Jones, right? Bob Jones, when he logs on, he'll have to put in a phone number, email address, all that. But notice something else. We've got require re-register of MFA. So when he registers with MFA, he'll be able to use that to prove who he is, multi-factor authentication. But we can also require him to re-register, okay, if we want. So we could force him to re-register multi-factor authentication later down the road. Maybe we suspect somehow somebody has tricked him or something, gotten access to his account. We can force a require a re-register if we want, okay? So from there, I can jump back over here to the multi-factor authentication page. I can enable this for Bob Jones. We'll go ahead and say enable multi-factor auth, okay? Just like that, it's now officially turned on for Bob Jones, okay? At that point, if I want, I can enforce this. So notice here it says about non-browser applications. So after multi-factor auth is enforced, users will need to create app passwords to use non-browser applications such as Outlook or Link. For security reasons, app passwords are not available to admins who will be able to sign in only with the browser. Okay, so if we enforce this, the issue you may run into there is what about older applications? They say Outlook and Link, but actually that's not true. It's not just all versions of Outlook and all that. It's legacy applications like Outlook 2010. If you have like Outlook 2013, the app has no problem supporting multi-factor authentication. So you can go out there and search. Microsoft's got some information on some of the apps that are considered legacy or not. The problem is, obviously, if you force multi-factor authentication and a user's using an older app like that, they just won't be able to log on, and that's obviously a bad thing. Some of your legacy applications just don't support multi-factor authentication with Microsoft. So this is going to be a workaround for you, okay? So I can enforce multi-factor authentication right now if I want to, and they're warning me that if I'm going to enforce it, the user is not going to have any choice every time they log on. They're going to be, they're going to have this enforced multi-factor auth enabled, and this is going to throw off the app password scenario, the legacy apps. But we can create what's called app passwords for the user, and I'll show you a little bit more on this. Just stick with me for a second. I'm going to click enforced, okay, and so we've enforced that. For Bob Jones. We've also got manage user settings. Manage user settings says require selected users to provide contact methods again. So I could go ahead and check that if I wanted the user, when they log back on the next time, they're going to have to provide all their contact info again. I've got delete all existing app passwords. Okay, so again, an app password is going to involve when the user logs on, they can create an app password that will basically be able to bypass multi-factor auth for legacy applications like Outlook 2012. Okay, so that's basically what that's going to do for you. If you want to delete those, so the user has to create a new one, it'll let them create a new one upon their next sign in. And then restore multi-factor authentication on all remembered devices. So if I want any device that's previously used multi-factor authentication with this, it'll restore that multi-factor information for all the remembered devices. And at that point, multi-factor auth will still work with those. Okay, so I can save that if I want. I can come right here now. This is what I really want to show you. Come right here to where it says Service Settings and click on Service Settings here. Okay, now at that point, you're going to notice it says App Passwords. Okay, so you're basically saying allow users to create app passwords to sign into non-browser apps. So that's your legacy applications I was just talking about. They do have a Learn More you can click on that, and it's going to provide you with some more information on it. But if you actually go out there and you search in a search engine like Google, MFA app passwords, they have an article that gives you a little bit more information on all this. So I've got configure app passwords for
Azure multi-factor. So you can check that article out if you want. But a couple things here. Okay, so number one, they mention here's just like what I was telling you, the Outlook, the Office 2010 products like Outlook 2010, all that. They tell you that modern applications are fine, right? Office 2013, all that's good. So some of your considerations. So here's a consideration for you. There's a limit. You can have up to 40 app passwords per user. So that is a concern, a consideration when dealing with this. But some of the facts there. Applications that cache passwords and use them on-premise scenarios can fail because app passwords isn't known outside the work account. Azure multi-factor authentication is enabled on a user. App passwords can be used with non-browser clients like Outlook and Skype for Business. So a couple things there. And then, of course, your app passwords will have names associated with them. Outlook, Word, whatever app they're using. If it's an older application. Okay. They also mention if you're using ADFS, there's some federation considerations here. App passwords can be supported, but there's some configuration here that would have to be set up. Now, as far as users using it, you're going to enable it right where we are right here. You're going to allow it right here. Okay, and they tell you that. But when your users are logging on, they tell you right here too, user completes their initial setup for Azure multi-factor authentication, that's when they're going to have that option to create a app password. So we could allow that if we want right here, or we could say do not allow it. Of course, keep in mind the legacy applications would not be able to authenticate at that point. Another thing we've got here is we've got skip multi-factor authentication for requests from federated users if we want. We can do trusted IPs, and we can just basically put in IP addresses of where somebody might be authenticating. We've also got methods available for users for verification. We've got text, notification, verification code, call by phone, but you have to have a full tenant, a full-blown tenant support call by phone. Not a trial tenant. Then remember multi-factor authentication on trusted devices. So trusted devices, once a device is authenticated, it can become a trusted device. And it says allow users to remember multi-factor authentication on devices they trust between 1 and 365 days. So number of days users can trust device, that defaults to 90. Okay. They also warn you here, they say, or not warn you, but they provide a note. For optimal user experience, we recommend using conditional access sign-in frequency to extend the session lifetime on trusted devices. Basically, you can utilize what's known as a conditional access policy to control some of this and extend things out if you need to. So once you've configured what you want there, you can go ahead and click save the settings, and you've officially set up your multi-factor authentication for support for app passwords and for your users. I'd now like to talk about a helpful feature that is available to us with Azure AD called Self-Service Password Reset, also known as SSPR. Now, this is a great feature in a situation where a user gets locked out of their account or forgets their password or something along those lines, and they need to reset their password. It's very similar to pretty much any website you've been to where you've done the forgot your password option. Now, a couple things you need to understand first, and things you want to remember about this is that, number one, it is disabled by default. SSPR is not turned on by default. You have to turn it on, okay? Secondly, you have to have one of the Microsoft 365 business licenses or at least Azure AD Premium 1 in order to get this. So if you don't have one of the Microsoft 365 business licenses or Azure AD Premium 1 at least, you won't have this feature available to you. Okay, so very important. You got to have the licensing for it, and you got to have it turned on. So let's see how we can do that. All right, so here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button. We're going to go to Azure Active Directory. Okay, from there, there's a blade called Password Reset. So we're just going to click on the Password Reset blade. All right, and you'll notice that Self-Service Password Reset is turned off. So if we want to turn this on, we can click Select, and we can select certain groups. We want to maybe turn this on for certain users we want to turn this on for, or user groups, sorry. Certain user groups we want to turn this on for, we can do that. Or we can click all and we can turn this on for everyone. Okay. Once you've done that, you're going to click save, and then you're going to go over to authentication methods. Okay. And then from there, you will it gives you a few different options. The first would be that you have to give a user the ability to prove who they are in order to reset their account, or reset their password, right? So there's two by default, which is email and mobile phone. So a user can have an email address registered that they have access to. They can have a mobile phone registered that they can have access to, and of course, if they'll do an email, it sends them the information via email. If they've got a mobile phone, it'll basically text them a code. They can unlock their account that way. So that's how they're going to prove their account. You also can do the mobile app code method. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Microsoft has an app called the Microsoft Authenticator app. You can download it on your phone, tablet. It's free. It doesn't cost any money. And there's two different ways you can use the app. Two main ways you can use the app. The first method is it'll give you a one-time passcode like you see here, and basically the number just changes every 30 seconds. Okay. And another option is when you go to sign on, it'll ask you if you approve the sign-in. And if you say yes, it'll authenticate you. So the default one that you got here is just that code that changes every 30 seconds. But you can also do a mobile app notification that will basically just ask you, do you approve the sign-in? But you can't select that option unless you at least do require two methods up here. So you notice it's no longer grayed out when you choose two. Okay. You can also do an office phone where it can call, where basically you'll get like a Siri type, or a Cortana, I should say, type voice that'll call you on the phone, and you'll authorize it that way. Or you can do security questions. So if you go to security questions, you can basically require up to 5 questions answered. So a user, the next time they log on, they'll have to answer 5 questions, and then it'll remember those answers. And then that you can set how many they got to get right in order to change their password. So if they registered 5 questions, it'll ask them 3 questions, and they got to get 3 right in order for it to work. From there, you can also select which questions you want. Okay, I can go predefine. I can select the 5 questions I want. I can also write custom questions right here. So very easy, as you can see, to configure self-service password reset. At that point, when a user goes to log on, they can't remember their password, they have the ability to reset their password. It also, not really getting into all this right now, but Azure does have artificial intelligence. If it thinks that you are a hacker, it thinks your account has been breached, it may do a force self-service password reset where a user is forced to prove who they are in order to log on. So there's another reason why this might kick in. But most of the time, this is simply for somebody who has forgotten their password and they need to prove their account so they can log on. All right. And that is, and of course you got to save all this, but that is how you can implement SSPR, also known as self-service password reset. So when it comes to password management in the Azure Active Directory environment, obviously if you have self-service password reset enabled, SSPR, this is a feature that's going to allow users to reset their own passwords. All right. But what about when admins need to do this manually? So there might come a time where an administrator needs to be able to just reset a user's password and log on to that user's account. Like, imagine a situation, and we don't like to have this come up, but imagine if you had an employee that passed away, and you've now got to get access to that user's information, and so you need to reset their password so that you could log on as them and get access to their data and all of that. All right. How would we do that? Well, let's look at that. All right. So here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory Blade. We're going to click Users, and we'll just pick a user. Again, you may not have the same users as me, so that's fine if you're doing this with me, but I'm just going to pick a user. And then right here, Reset Password. So I can click Reset Password, and then at that point, I just click Reset. And then it tells me a temporary password that I can use for that user. Okay. Now keep in mind, when you log on as that user with this password, it is going to change the password immediately. Or if you had to reset it for a user, it might not be a situation where the user passed away. It might be that you just needed to reset the password for the user. You would give them this temporary password. They would log on. It will force them to change the password as soon as they log back on. Okay. So that's the idea there. Now you can also go over here to authentication methods, and this is where you can look at other options for authentication. This would get into things like multi-factor authentication. It would also get into the ability for a user, if they were using self-service password reset, these are the ways that they can verify that they're the owner of the account. So you can, if you're using that, you could even force them, if they've put this information in before, you can force them to be able to reset it. So require a re-register it, makes them reset it, or you can even revoke that multi-factor authentication. Not really getting into multi-factor authentication in this video. I'm just mentioning it briefly here, the fact that this is what would happen if you enabled multi-factor authentication. Then they would register a phone number or alternate phone number and an email address, and these are ways that they can prove that they are the owner of the account if they ever had to reset their password. Okay. So that is the idea or the concepts when it comes to dealing with password resets in Azure. Okay. Now, if I go back over to the menu button here, we go to Azure Active Directory again. Let's go down here to the security blade. There is a area here. If I go down to, let's see, authentication methods, there is an area called password protection. And you can see there's a lockout threshold here. So this is a thing called smart lockout, and you have a lockout threshold set to 10. So you can see this is how many, they tell you here, this is how many failed sign-in attempts are allowed on the account before they're locked out. And so it'll allow up to 10. And if they put in 10 failed sign-in attempts, it locks them out for a minute. This is to stop what's called password. This is a situation where if somebody was trying to do like an online brute force attack or dictionary attack against somebody's account, where they're just trying random passwords, it would prevent a system from being able to send thousands and thousands of passwords per second, because it would get locked out for a minute. So that's the idea there. You can also have custom banned passwords. So you can download a list. If you go to Google and search for like the top 10,000 most common passwords, you can copy and paste a password list in here, and it'll ban those passwords from being used. So users can't use simple passwords. Also, if it says password protection for Windows Server Active Directory, if your company is using on-premise Active Directory, you can enable password protection on the Windows Server Active Directory. It'll link on-premise Active Directory to the password list here. So that's pretty neat. And right now, we're just in audit mode. So that means that it's not actually going to enforce the things that you see here. You would have to switch this to enforced in order for that to happen. Right now, it's just going to log that if somebody violates this, if they attempt to use the banned passwords and all that, it's just gonna audit that. Okay, so that's the idea there. So you could set that to enforce. You could click save, and there you go. All right. And so those are your authentication methods. So those are the various ways, those are the various kind of things to keep in mind when thinking about passwords in Azure Active Directory. I want to talk now about the concept of conditional access policies. Now, conditional access policies is a feature that is able to sort of connect all the different detection signals that Azure has, and based on some conditions that you can set, these conditional access policies can decide whether or not they're just going to completely block the user and device from connecting, or if they're going to challenge the user in some way, perhaps by forcing multi-factor authentication or something like that to kick in. All right, so let's take a look at what we're talking about here. Here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click on the menu button, and we're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. From there, we're going to go down to the security blade, and you'll see a blade called Conditional Access. We're going to go ahead and click on that, and then we're going to click to create a new policy. Okay. Now, maybe this is the scenario. Okay. Imagine we have a situation where we have some sales users that maybe work from home,
in our environment, and it's been reported that some of these sales users are using an older email client that uses something called ActiveSync. And this is seen as a security risk for us, and maybe we would like to either block that, or perhaps maybe we want to enact multi-factor authentication or something along those lines. All right, so this is an email problem. We have some sales users that are using an older legacy application that uses ActiveSync, like some old version of Outlook or something, and we want to, or mobile Outlook, we want to just block them, or we want to challenge them with multi-factor authentication. All right, so I'm going to call this sales ActiveSync policy. All right, and then from there we're going to go down to users, and from there we'll say include only the selected users. So we'll say the selected users are going to be the sales group. Okay, so there is our sales group. We'll select sales. All right, and so then we've got a few options. We could say cloud apps, based on maybe if the users are using specific cloud apps. I could say all, or I could select apps. In this case, you could go through and you could select what apps you want. Now, in this case, with me, I am not actually the ActiveSync and all that is a legacy app, so it's not really going to be seen as a cloud app. But if this policy was going to affect some of the newer style cloud apps like Office 365 and all that, you could select that particular app, and this policy would only be in effect if a user was using that specific app. Okay, but I am not going to select any there. Then we're going to go down here to conditions, and you have user risk. This would be if the user was seen as a risk. So this ties in with what's called Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, and it would be detected if the user was detected as a risk, low, medium, or high, and also if the user was detected to be a sign-in risk. Perhaps Azure has suspected that this user's account's password has been stolen by somebody, and you could have low, medium, or high, and it would base a threat level. So if you selected either of these, this policy would only take effect if the user was currently seen as a low, medium, or high, either sign-in risk or user risk. Okay. And this is not really the lecture. We talk a lot about Azure Identity Protection right now, but that's what those are. All right, this ties in with Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. So we'll go down here to device platforms. This would be if we wanted it to be a specific platform. All right, and maybe this is going to be it is only Windows devices that we've had this issue with. So we'll go with that. We'll say Windows. All right. So then from there, locations would be like particular subnets. You could actually create what are called locations in Azure, and maybe like a particular TCP/IP subnet. You could select that there. Then we have client apps. All right, so this is the one we're actually looking for here. We would say yes, and so you have modern authentication apps. The problem isn't with modern authentication apps; it's with this ActiveSync client. So this is a legacy style email client that can have that could be seen as a security risk, and maybe we want to either block it or enact multi-factor authentication. So we're going to select that. We've got a new feature down here, filter devices, filter for devices. You can actually be a little bit more specific. You can actually select properties of the device like device ID, device name, things like that. You could specify values, but I'm not going to do that in this case. All right, so from there we go down here to grant. This is going to specify whether or not we're going to grant or block. So if I wanted to, I could just simply say block, right? I could also say grant, and then if I wanted to say, okay, we're going to grant access to these legacy, perhaps maybe we have no choice, maybe we absolutely have to have some of these legacy devices using this old ActiveSync client, but we're going to require MFA, okay, if we want to. Or again, we could just say block if we wanted to. You can also do some other things here. Require device to be marked as compliant, so it'd also have to meet compliance of the company. Require hybrid, if you had a hybrid environment between an on-premise domain. Require approved clients, so you'd have a list of approved clients there. You got require app protection policies if you wanted to implement that with the help of Intune. Require a password change, marketing promo. This is a newer little feature they've got. You require all the selected ones, or you could require one of the selected ones. So in my case, I'm just going to go with this top one. I'm going to hit select. And you've also got this new session feature over here, which we don't really need in this case, but they tell you to control access based on session controls. You can enable a limited experience with specific cloud apps. We're not really doing cloud apps in this case, but you can utilize these little features as well. All right. So at that point, if I want to return this on, I can go ahead and just turn it on. I can have it report only, turn on, or turn off. I'm going to say turn on, click create. And I've now officially implemented my sales active sync policy. So that is what a conditional access policy would do for you. This is only going to affect the people in the sales group. It would not affect anybody else, and they would have to be using an active sync based client, those older email based clients, for this policy to affect them. And if that was the case, it would force them to use MFA. And if they couldn't use multi-factor authentication and they couldn't authenticate through multi-factor authentication, well, it would just not let them in. They would not be able to utilize, they wouldn't be able to check their email. So this would, this just adds that additional layer of protection, forcing them to use MFA. Again, I could go in there and set it to block if I wanted to. All right, but that's the idea of a conditional access policy. It's a great way to sort of utilize a lot of the different signals that Azure AD is using to detect threats and things like that, and then decide whether or not we're going to block or we're going to allow the user based on certain criteria. So let's take a look now at how we can work with roles in our Azure environment. So we're going to start by looking at roles in terms of Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, and how it controls administration. So to begin with here, we're on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the little menu button here, and we're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. From there is a blade called Roles and Administrators. We're going to go ahead and click on Roles and Administrators, and you'll be able to then see all of the different roles that are available. Okay, so a bunch of different pre-assigned or pre-created roles that are built right into Azure Active Directory. Now, you will also notice a little green ribbon over some of these roles. Those are generally considered newer roles that Microsoft has added. But there's lots and lots of different roles here, and the thing I always recommend is to kind of familiarize yourself with the type of thing you're trying to achieve in Azure, and then look for some of these different roles that might be associated with that. For example, if I was trying to give somebody rights to manage security in Azure AD, then I might look for the keyword security, right? So let's see if we can find that. And there you go. You've got 3 roles right out of the gates there that involve security. If I was dealing with the Microsoft 365 side of things, and I was dealing with like Microsoft Exchange or Teams, SharePoint, I would look for those keywords, right? So if we kind of look through here, you'll see there's Exchange Administrator, Recipient Administrator. If we look down, we've got a bunch of Teams related roles. We've got SharePoint. Let's see, we kind of scroll down a little bit there. There's SharePoint Administrator. You've got roles like Yammer Administrator, Microsoft's little social media thing they've got. Lots and lots of different roles here that we can look at. Now, the key to this whole thing, though, is just kind of understanding and getting a feel for what each role does. So, for example, if we're talking about security and we want to look at the security administrators and all that, we have the 3 different security roles. Let's start with security reader. You have a brief summary of what it is, but let's click on it. And then from there, we're going to click on description, and we can read what the description says. It says that users with this role have global read-only access, including all information in Azure Active Directory, identity protection, privileged identity management, as well as the ability to read Azure Active Directory sign-in reports, audit logs. It says this role also grants read-only access in Office 365. And if you look, or Office 365 security and compliance, but if you look, you can kind of scroll down and you can see what the role permissions are. So these are the different areas of Azure. You can kind of drill down and see, what areas in the Azure environment, as well as the Microsoft Office 365 environment, that they're getting. And most notably, you're noticing that it says read access to pretty much everything. So you can see it says security reader, as you can probably imagine, has read access to things, right? If we click assignments, we can see if anybody has been assigned this role yet, and as you can see, nobody has, right? So let's go back over to this. And by the way, these little things over here called breadcrumbs. Click on those, or you can just click back. Let's look at security operator. Now you can imagine a security operator is probably going to have a little bit more privilege than a security reader. So let's click on security operator. Let's click description. And then it says users with this role can manage alerts and have global read-only access on security-related feature, including all information in Microsoft 365 Security Center, Azure Active Directory, Identity Protection, Privileged Identity Management. I know we haven't really gone over what all that stuff is right now, but you can see these different items that you get. And then if you look, you can also see the privileges. You'll notice it doesn't just say read next to everything. So Microsoft Directory, Cloud App Security, all properties, all tasks, create and delete resources. So you can see these different privileges that they're getting on top of all the read stuff that they're getting as well, which essentially security operator can also read everything like a security reader. You'll also notice that you have these additional articles. I always, recommend when you're working with Azure, Microsoft, one of the things that they're really great about that they weren't so great about with their older server-based operating systems that were on-premise is providing easy-to-get-to documentation. Nowadays, Microsoft, while you're looking at the different components in Azure, they have articles associated with those that you can very easily just click on and read to get a little bit more information. But anyway, let's go back and let's check out the security administrator. Of course, you can probably imagine the security administrator is going to be a step above a security operator. So we're going to click on that. And then from there, we'll go to description. It says users with this role have all the read-only permissions of security reader role, plus the ability to manage configuration for security-related services, Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, Azure Information Protection, Privileged Identity Management, and the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. And then you can take a look here and you can see you've got quite a few different permissions here that are available for this role. Okay, so one of the big things that I highly recommend you do is when you are trying to understand certain roles, click on the role, click the description, read the description, and kind of skim through what those permissions are, and that'll definitely give you a good base understanding of what that role does. Okay, we've even got a user administrator role. This is a role that lets people create users. That's one of the normal things that an IT team might need, is they might need to give an administrator the ability to create and manage user accounts. But they don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom, as they say. They want to give them least privilege. So if you had like a junior level admin that was in charge of maybe creating user accounts for new hires, new people that have been hired at the company, this would be a good role. So if we click on that role, click description, it says users with this role can create and manage all aspects of users and groups. Additionally, this role includes the ability to manage support tickets, monitor service health. Some restrictions apply for, kind of sounds like an infomercial there, doesn't it? Some restrictions may apply. But it says, for example, this role does not allow deleting a global administrator. So you're going to notice that the user administrator role doesn't really have a lot of control over higher level roles like global admins and all that. So user account administrators can change passwords for users, help desk administrators, and other user accounts. And other user account administrators only. So doesn't, the higher level admin and all that, global administrator and all that doesn't have, this role does not give you privilege over that. Speaking of which, the global administrator being the most powerful role that we have in Azure, let's take a look at it. So we'll scroll up just a little bit. We'll go to global administrator here. You'll notice that for assignments, you'll notice that I am assigned global administrator, and if you've created a tenant to play around with, you should also have global administrator privileges. So you have all the power to do what you need to do. So we click description. You can see here, big, huge description, which to sum it up basically tells you have access to pretty much everything. And then you can kind of scroll down too and look at the different role permissions that you got, which is a tremendous amount of different rights that Azure gives you. So again, you don't want to give this role just out to anybody. Okay. So another thing we can do here is we can click to create a new custom role if we want. All right. I'm just going to call this demo role. You can say with baseline permissions, start from scratch, or clone a custom role. So clone from a custom role. So what you can actually do there is, if you've already created a custom role and you wanted to duplicate it and maybe create another role with a few additional things, you could do that. But we'll have to start from scratch because we haven't done that. We haven't created any other roles. So we'll click next here, and then from there we can look through all these different permissions. You can even do searches for permissions and select the permissions that you want. Okay. So I could go through and just pick whichever ones I want, just to kind of play around with this a little bit. But you can go through and choose whatever this role is going to do in your organization. You can pick the permissions you want to give. Then you would click next. Here's all the things that I've selected. I can click create, and at that point I've now created this role. Now the other thing you'll notice is that when you do create the role, you'll see it gives you kind of a little orange looking cube symbol next to it, as opposed to like a green blue type of cube. So that just indicates that this is a custom role. It also tells you over there it's a custom role. And of course you can also, if we click on this and go into it, you can start assigning users to it and all that stuff if you want. And of course, if you go back to roles and administrators, we can, if we do a new custom role, you'll notice that from here, if I say clone from a custom role, I could do that, and then I could actually add additional privileges. So kind of like the security reader, if you had if you wanted to give like a bunch of read privileges, and then another one would be like an operator type role, you could add some additional functionality to that if you wanted to. All right. So that is how we can work with roles from the Azure AD perspective. Now, the other aspect of roles is giving access over actual resources in Azure. Okay, so when you start working with resources, you start creating virtual machines, and you're adding applications into Azure, and you need to give privileges over those. All right. So you're going to use roles to do that as well. So what we're looking at right here is just purely administrative roles over Azure AD and all the things that are connected to Azure AD, which is pretty much everything in Azure, as well as Microsoft 365 services. However, what about the individual items that we work with in Azure? Okay, so like for example, if I go here to this menu button here, and I'm going to click resource groups. Now, a resource group is a container that you will use to contain your Azure services. All Azure components, all resources in Azure must be kept inside of a resource group. Okay, so if I click to create a resource group, I have to select a subscription, and then I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it Roles Demo RG, which is just Roles Demo Resource Group, right? And then I have to select a region. That's the area of the world where the data center is, which is basically where the Azure locations are throughout the world. Microsoft has supposedly 60-something different regions of the world where their data centers are. On average, they can have about 3 data centers per region. And most of the time, you want to select a region that's going to be closest to where you're working, okay? Because you're going to be interacting with these resources, or if not where you're working, maybe where users are working that are going to be most commonly using these resources, okay? And of course, another thing to consider with your regions is where the actual region is you select. Sometimes resources may be more expensive in that region. Of course, I'm not really getting into this right now, but I will get into this concept of, if you think about cost and all that, there is ways to check to see what the cost of different resources are, but I'm not really talking about that right now. So I'm just going to select the, in this case, the East US region, which is closest sort of where I'm at. And then at that point, I'm going to click, I'm not talking about tags right now, but I'm going to click Review and Create, and then I'm going to click to create, and you should then at that point have a resource group, okay? It's one of the fastest things you can create in Azure, but the point of this isn't really to explain resource groups a whole lot. I want to talk mostly about access control. So a resource group is a container that can contain resources. This will be things like virtual machines and all of that. But you have to give access to those resources, right? So what you're going to find is that the different resource groups as well as the different resources have a blade called IAM, okay? IAM. Now, if you're not familiar with what IAM stands for, it stands for Identity and Access Management. So you'll see that right here. It says Access Control, but the actual acronym IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So we're going to click on that, and then from there, you can see that it says check access. I can say view my access, which will show you, what level of access somebody has been given, or you have been given. In this case, I've been given owner access over this resource. All right. So you can see my privilege. Pretty much owner access is the highest level access you can get, right? It says you also are user access administrator as well. And this is because it's all been inherited from from the fact that you're a global admin and you created the role or created the resource group. Okay. We can click on role assignments and we can see what role assignments that we've got in here. All right. So from here, mostly what you're going to see here, it says items. There's 2 users, 1 service principal, and 9 managed identities. All this stuff here, not really getting into what all this is right now. This is the Kubernetes side of things, which gets into the being able to manage a large amount of virtual machines and all that. But what I want to look at down here, you'll notice the John Christopher is the owner. These are our user-related services. Now, again, not that I won't eventually talk about some of this other stuff here, but just you can kind of ignore that right now because we're not talking about Kubernetes and the services involved and all of that. But what I want to mostly focus on is my users that have been added. So, and this was added automatically because I was the one who created the resource group. Okay, I'm going to click on roles, and you can see all the roles that are available. These are different privileges that can be given out. Okay, the owner privilege is the most powerful role you can give somebody because basically they can do anything they want if they are the owner of something, including delete it if they want, right? And then you've got contributor, right? Contributor is somebody that can they can add things, they can modify things, but it doesn't necessarily give them the ability to delete everything. And then you've got the reader role, which gives them the ability to read stuff. Okay, so you have all these different roles, and if we click on if we click add right here, we can say add role assignment if we want. And you can choose from these different built-in roles. And you can also click View Details, and it shows you the privileges. So I know that's one of the things that gets a little confusing is you're like, well, it gives me a basic description here of what this role does, but how do I see everything it can do? Well, you can see everything it can do by clicking this little View button right here. And then from there, you can look through all these different privileges that are given to this user, okay, or given to this role. And it basically, if you assign the role to a user or to a group, you're giving out all those privileges to that user or to that group. So the owner, as you can see here, the owner has the majority, the most amount of privileges of all. Okay, so one little homework assignment for you, you can go through and just kind of skim through these different roles and just kind of familiarize yourself with all these different permissions. There's a lot of different ones. Now, I'm not saying you need to go through and read what all these are. There are lots of these that are related to applications and Kubernetes and things that we're not talking about in this video, okay? But definitely the main thing to do is to familiarize yourself with these 3 roles: owner, contributor, and reader. Those would be the 3 I would recommend, okay? Now, the other thing you can do, not only can you assign somebody these roles, right? So you can go through and say, okay, I want to make somebody a contributor, so we'll go next, and we say, okay, is it going to be a user, group, or service principal? Service principal will be some of the different services that are available in Azure, which I'll talk about later, or some kind of a managed identity, a specific identity that I want to specify, which, again, not really talking about managed identities in this video either. But I could then go through and say, okay, well, I want to assign a specific person, a specific member. Maybe this is going to be Larry Thomas, select. right? And we're going to go ahead and review and assign. We're going to give Larry Thomas the ability to be a contributor. So he's now a contributor of this, okay? Now the other thing you can do is when it comes to adding roles, if you click add, you can create a custom role, right? So custom role name, I'm just going to call this custom demo. You can clone a existing role, right? Like contributor, or let's do reader. Clone reader, start from scratch, or do JSON JavaScript object notation, which I'm not talking about in this video, but this is a scripting language you can use. From there, click next, and I'm giving this read, and I can add permissions to that. All right, so here's all these different permissions that you could add. You could familiarize yourself with these, okay? All right. Go here to Microsoft Purview, which is going to involve what's called compliance and stuff like that. In Azure and Microsoft 365, you could give privileges there if you wanted. All right, I know this is a lot and it's overwhelming. If you are somebody that is new to Azure, believe me, I could make it a lot more overwhelming, and I'm trying not to. That's why you'll notice that I'm not getting into what certain things are right now, but stay tuned, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're seeing, these different terms that you're seeing, that'll get covered eventually. You just got to give me time to get there on some of this stuff. But try not to let it overwhelm you, because that is one of the things that gets people. All right. And scopes, not talking about what scopes are just yet. So then this is the JavaScript object notation. Not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to click next, and we're going to click create, and we've now created a little custom role. Okay. All right. So that is how we can deal with roles. Now keep in mind that roles can be assigned at different levels. I'm assigning a role at the resource group level. So that means that the permissions that I'm setting here are assigning these permissions for this resource group, this container, and then everything below that container. Okay, keep in mind you cannot have resource groups inside of other resource groups. Okay, but everything that's in this container, I would be setting permissions on it, right? If I go back over here to overview, or I'm sorry, if I go back over to IAM, the access control, right? You can see role assignments. Any role assignments that you've got, roles that you've been given. Sometimes this will take a minute to update, but from there, that's how you can control roles on an individual object, and that's also how we work with roles in Azure Active Directory. We're now going to take a look at assigning roles. So you may or may not be familiar with the different access control models. So for many, many, many years, going all the way back to the paper-based documentation days, where access control was managed through paper-based solutions, there's been a lot of different models and strategies that organizations have used to control permissions over certain objects, as well as administrative rights over documentation. And one of the models we're going to take a look at here, this is the model that Microsoft sort of puts all of their focus on in regards to their cloud. It's known as RBAC, Role-Based Access Control. Along with that, there actually was some other models and some other models that can be implemented in your environment as well. There's a model called DAC, which involves discretionary access control, which is really just all about ownership. The owner makes decisions. And if you look back at Active Directory in the past, you may note that that's one of the main ways that we dealt with rights in our environment was based on ownership. So we would create a file, and if you were the owner of the file, you had full control over it, and then you could grant other people access. And you can still use the DAC model to this day in your environment if you want, and or in the cloud obviously as well. Now you've also got MAC, Mandatory Access Control. Mandatory Access Control is where we're basing our rights and permissions on classification, labels, being able to label documentation and classify it. And then, of course, when I think of MAC, I sort of think of the military, because it'll involve things like security clearances, security levels. So, like in the military, you have secret and top secret and all of that. And then finally, we have RBAC, which is the one we care about right now. RBAC is Role-Based Access Control. And the way that role-based access control works is the privileges or the rights that you're given are based upon the role you play in the organization. Okay, so there's two different ways you can sort of look at RBAC and manage RBAC in your environment. One is from a user's perspective, where we're granting a privilege over some kind of a resource in our Azure environment based upon roles. And then the other is from the administrative perspective. So RBAC is going to allow an administrator to grant other administrators privileges to things in your environment, control over your environment. This is going to include both Azure as well as your Microsoft 365 environment. What you're going to find is you've got a mix of roles. Some of the roles are going to be in the Azure portal, which is what we're going to sort of focus on right now. And then a little bit later, we're going to also focus on the Microsoft 365 side, where you're going to see that there are some roles that are specific to the security of Microsoft 365. Okay, so one thing I really love about roles is roles allow us to see exactly what privileges our users are getting, our administrators are getting. One of the annoying things about group-based access control, which, you know, going back years and years with ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, you might recall that you would create a group, you'd put people in the group, you would then assign permissions to the group and give them the rights they need. But then here's the problem. There was nothing that really documented what rights those groups had. I mean, you could go to the access control list of the resource, like let's say it's a file server, and you go to the share or the folder or whatever, the file, and look at the permissions over that file, the ACL, the access control list. But then the issue is you'd have to do that for every file and folder you wanted to see if you wanted to see if that group actually had rights to that object. There was no way for you just to simply go to the group and see everything the group had gotten access to. Don't get me wrong, there were some tools out there that could sort of kind of make this happen. You could actually make it happen with PowerShell if you wrote a script that went through, but you're talking loads and loads of processing power just to get it to spider its way across your environment to determine what rights that this group had. And so what can happen is you create a group, you grant it permission, you add people to it, and then over time more people get added to it, and it gets given more permissions and more permissions. Next thing you know, 5 years down the road, this object, this group, has gotten access to all sorts of crazy things in your environment, and you have no way really knowing it. And it really got difficult. So you could kind of sort of achieve RBAC with groups if you created a hierarchical group. But and I'm going to tell you, as being a consultant all these years too, I can say that almost nobody ever implemented that system. Unless I implemented it myself, rarely did anybody actually design a group hierarchy that worked to achieve an RBAC system. Now, in Microsoft 365 and Azure, the great thing about roles, the way they've designed it, I really feel like Microsoft got this right. The way they designed it, okay, you create a role, you then assign the rights to the role, and the role records exactly what rights it has, and they're documented on the role itself. And they used JSON. Okay, if you're familiar with that, the Java language, JSON, and the way it works with JSON in this case with RBAC is every time a right is given, it has to be added to that role. So there's no way that the role can be given rights to things and you not know. Okay, and then from there you can assign identities to that role and give those users rights. So you could add users or groups or whatever you want to those roles. And of course, identities can have more access to more than one role. So if I have a user who needs to be able to control Intune but not control Exchange, or maybe I have a user who needs to control Intune as well as SharePoint but not Exchange, I could have this user given the Intune administrator role and the SharePoint administrator role, but not the Exchange administrator role. So it gives me that ability to do this next thing, which is the principle of least privilege. So if you're not familiar with that term, that's another sort of cybersecurity term that you hear out there. Least privilege involves giving out the least amount of rights, but still allowing somebody to do their job. Okay, so giving out the least amount of rights, but still allowing them to do their job. All right. I do a lot of classes on military bases and things, and I know a lot of times I have to have them like vouch for me to get into the military base, and they give me a pass, and sometimes I have to be escorted in a building to my classroom, and I'm surprised I don't have to be escorted to the bathroom. But in those classes, that's an example of least privilege. They're giving me the least amount of rights to get on the base, to get into my classroom, do my class, and then leave. So I've had the honor of teaching a lot of military guys, a lot of cybersecurity classes, and all of that, and that's what always comes to my brain when I think of least privilege. But the logic is this. Okay, so if you've got somebody who only needs to perform a certain action, then you should give out the bare minimum rights that they need, okay, as opposed to giving too many rights. All right, I'll never forget the very first company I ever worked for in the 1990s as an administrator. I was a junior level admin, and they're like, "Congratulations, you're hired." So I get hired, and they put me, they give me access to, this was an NT network, so I get access to a tool called User Manager for Domains. Some of you guys might remember that old tool. And I open it up, and I noticed that there's like 80 people that are domain admins, and I'm one of them. So they're kind of like, "Congratulations, you're hired." And then all of a sudden I'm a domain admin, and there's like 80 people that are domain admins. And I start looking through the list, and I'm like, wait a minute, that guy's a sales guy. Why is he a domain admin? You know what I mean? So that's an example of not using least privilege. And I think sometimes people in their environments get too much into giving these rights out when to just achieve something. The person wants to install programs on their computer. Let's make them a domain admin. That was sort of the logic. So you definitely, in today's world, with the amount of cybersecurity issues that we have, we definitely want to use least privilege. And Microsoft highly encourages this. And one tip I'll give you on the exam is that always assume they want least privilege. So if you're looking at a scenario where they're saying, "Hey, this user needs the ability to go in and make changes to Intune," okay, as an administrator, but you don't want them having control over the entire Azure environment, or even heck, even if they don't say that, assume least privilege is always what they want, okay? That's going to be one tip I give you. So I'm not going to make the person a global administrator. The global administrator role is the most powerful role that you can have in Azure Microsoft 365. You basically have, as I like to say, intergalactic cosmic powers over Azure and Microsoft 365 if you're a global admin. Yes, you can control Intune, but you can also control everything else, and that's too many rights for people. Now, another thing that's really cool about our environments is Microsoft has implemented PIM. PIM is Privileged Identity Management. Okay, PIM allows us to achieve JIT, which is just-in-time administration. Just-in-time administration means I can give out role access temporarily. It can be scheduled, and it can go away after a certain amount of time. Another thing that can happen is a user can request permissions, request privileges for a certain amount of time if they need to. So, if you have an admin that's going on vacation and this person is the one who creates accounts, for example, and then you could give this privilege over to somebody else while you're on vacation. This person could request that access, get it for a temporary amount of time, utilize that control, create the account, and then of course the privileges go away. So just-in-time administration is all part of this privileged identity management, which of course builds upon roles. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.